All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. We've been going over Course Technologies, JavaScript, 6th edition text, and we're up to Chapter 6 of 12. Chapter 6, which starts in our textbook on page 363, is entitled Enhancing and Validating Forms. Our objectives here, we want to be able to enhance form usability with JavaScript, customize browser-based HTML validation, implement custom validation to check for errors and display error messages. Now, when you start talking about how to validate a form, there are several ways that you can choose to validate or not validate. The absolute worst way is what I like to call the ostrich defense. And there, what happens is you do no validation whatsoever, and you assume, like an ostrich that ducks its head in the sand, that people won't see it, or that people are naturally good and will do things the right way, etc. Well, that's the worst way because it's no validation whatsoever. One of the things that we've learned in an earlier chapter of the other book that we were using is that HTML5 now has some built-in client-side form validation. And we're talking here about validating on the client side. All right. And they have things like required, where you can put that in there under any form field, and now that field is required, and if you don't put a value in there, you're going to get an error message. So you can do that as an example. All right, there are things that you can do, like you can set up a field and say that the type, rather than being text, is email. And there's other things that you can do also, but those are built into HTML5 itself. So that's I don't know if you'd call it the good news or whatever, but if you have someone who is using an earlier version before HTML5, an older browser, they may not support most, or all of this stuff. Well, the other way that you can do client-side form validation is that you can set it up with JavaScript. Now, as we'll see in the last chapter of the text, not only can you use JavaScript, but you can use a JavaScript library named jQuery. And there are other JavaScript libraries that you can use as well. All right? But what we're concerned with in this chapter is, in most of the chapter at least, is form validation. So when you validate a form, for lack of better words, when you validate a form, what you're doing is you're trying to make sure that the user has entered information that conforms to whatever rules that you've set up. So for instance, if you ask someone their salary, typically it would only make sense if they put a numeric value in there. If they put a non-numeric value in there, that should be considered to be unacceptable. Now, as you can see in the second bullet here, a form object represents a form element in an HTML document. And the form object has got several different properties. All right. And if we start taking a look at some of them, you've got autocomplete. And notice that if it's set to true, what will happen is it'll try to add things for you, all right, that will help you, to give you a leg up or whatever. Now think about it, for autocomplete, that if you have a drop-down list that says state, and you put in, for example, an M, it's going to give you Michigan and Missouri and Montana, etc. So it'll give you states that begin with M. All right. The elements property of a form object returns a collection of all of the form elements. That's important because you can treat that as though it's an array, and you can kind of iterate your way through it to do certain things. Length, which returns an integer that represents the number of form elements you have. And no validate. Notice as it says, when it's set to false, it disables browser-based validation by a browser. There may be a reason that you may have some field or fields that you don't want validated for whatever reason. Now, the event for a form object is shown in the book on the top of page 365, and it's in the middle of this slide. It's the submit event. It's the event that automatically fires when the form's submit button has been clicked. All right, some methods of form objects. Notice there's check validity, which initiates browser-based validation of form controls, and it returns true if everything is valid, and otherwise, of course, it's going to return false. And submit, which submits a form without using a button. All right, and hopefully we'll see some place a little later on in here where that could be something you'd want to use. Now, forms contain a lot of different elements, including different types of input elements. All right, you can have a text box, password. There's a lot of them. The select, which works with the option for you to use drop downs. A text area, which allows you to set up something in rows and columns, so you can have multi-line input, and a button. Now again, these are just some of the common form elements. As far as the properties of some of these elements within a form, all right, notice there's autofocus, which when returns true indicates that the element should receive the focus when the form is loaded. Placeholder, where you can put in placeholder or helper text, and that text will be displayed if the field has no value, but as soon as you click in that field and start to enter things, the placeholder text will go away. Required, which again returns the value true if the HTML required attribute is set. Validation message, which sets or returns the text of a message to display after a failed submit. Validity, which returns true if the control passes browser-based validation rules. Value, which sets or gets the value of a control. And will validate, which returns true, as it says, if constraint validation is enabled for the control. Some other methods that can be used here. Check validity. This is the top of page 366 in the book, which runs constraint validation against a form and returns true if the value is valid and false if the value is invalid. And set custom validity, which sets that message that you see there, whatever kind of message that you want to have set, as the text to display to users if the control value is found to be invalid. All right, there are also some events of form elements that are shown on the page here. You can use, for example, the blur event. So imagine for a second that this was an HTML form. All right, and imagine I was right here on this field. If I take my mouse and I click off of this field and I click onto this field, two things happen. First, a blur event takes place because I've left one field to go to another. And then a focus event takes place as I go from one to the other. Now, the reason that that's important is you can put code or have associated code with neither method, with one method or the other, or with both methods. So blur is when you leave an element, focus is when you receive focus or when you enter an element. Change is when the focus leaves the element and the value or the selected state has been changed. Form change fires a change event. Form input fires an input event. Input is the value or selected state of the current element changes. And invalid, a control's value is found to be invalid during constraint validation. Hopefully, when you start working with some examples with this, it's going to make a little bit more sense. All right, remember, what we're doing here, what we talked about in the other book, the Terry Felk Morris book that we went through earlier, is we talked about ways in which you can validate forms using the built-in properties and methods of HTML5 itself. What we're discussing in this chapter is how you can do form validation, but how you can do form validation utilizing JavaScript, so programmatic form evaluation. All right? They show here one way that you can use the get elements by tag name, and you notice here the tag name is form, or whatever you call the form. All right? The document object includes a forms array, and the form object has an elements array. Again, I believe at least much of this won't make very much sense until you've actually gone through and run through some examples of this. You'll notice that there is an elements array, which, as mentioned, contains objects representing each form control. All right, and there's a forms array. Okay, these are all things that will make more sense when you start seeing different examples. Now, improving form usability before validation can reduce the amount of validation necessary. Well, one thing you can do is typically if you're going to have a form field, you're going to have a label that goes with it, and, or, but typically and, you're also going to have some placeholder text. You should try to make it as simple as possible for the person who is going to be utilizing the form, who's going to be filling it out, to be able to understand exactly what they should be entering into each field. And if you say, well, that just makes sense, yes, it does. Replacing input boxes with other fields that present limited choices. Well, let's look at an example, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. All right. Notice the difference between credit card type when you make the user enter in MasterCard, Visa, etc., or having option buttons. All right. And again, it may not sound like a big thing, but what for the credit card? What do you do if a person puts MasterCard in there as one word, or spells it wrong, or plays with a caseness, etc.? All right. You by offering option buttons, as you see in the second example there, you're making it much harder for the person to screw up. Now, you have no control. You have no control as the developer if the person who fills out the form in the second example, if they mean to put in a Visa and they type in MasterCard, you're not going to, that you really can't control. All right, that's just a mistake on the end user's part. But by giving them 4 examples there as opposed to letting them type in their own stuff, you're making it, again, harder for them to screw up. So if we look here in the book, this is table 6-7 that is shown in the book on page 370. And it says they're designing forms to collect more accurate content. Well, again, if you use things like option buttons, all right, type radio or checkboxes, you're limiting the number of possible selections. So again, you're forcing the user to select something. For instance, let's say that I had a radio button and it asked if you were in a 4-year educational institution, and I asked, are you a freshman, a sophomore, a junior, a senior, or maybe we even allow an other. Maybe you're just taking classes, and the classes that you're taking are for non-credit or something. But it's much easier to track people when you give them a few possibilities as opposed to giving them carte blanche when they can put in anything they want. And that's radio buttons or check boxes. The difference between those two is radio buttons are based off the old idea of an AM car radio, and you can only, if I have freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, or other with a radio button, you can only select one. But if you've ever gone, and I know it's been a little automated over the years, but in the past, where you could set something up for bold, italicized, or underlined, you might have had check boxes. which means that you could have selected none of those, one of those, two of those, or all three of those, as an example. All right, you can work with select list, and we've looked at that already. We've looked at select lists already as far as in the guise of utilizing that with states, so having a drop-down list with states. You can work with a slider, and a lot of times, that's going to be a bar with a minimum and a maximum. So, for instance, what if if I wanted to, I don't know why I would put this on an HTML form, but if I wanted to, I could have an HTML form that, as an example, could ask somebody their grade, let's say. And if I did that, what I could also add on there would be for their grade, I could have a slider that went from 0 to 100 where they put their grade in, something like that. Finally, there's data lists that are shown here. And a data list, as mentioned, it's a text box that suggests values. All right, so again, if I might ask you your favorite programming language, and if you start typing a P, it might show PHP and Pascal and other things that have a P, that either start with a P or have a P in them. All right, so I already mentioned this example to you. Programming forms to increase content accuracy. Again, assistive functions. You want to make it as hard for the user to screw up as possible. And please, please, think of why you'd want to do that. Because again, the idea, what you're looking for, is you want the user, if they're filling out a form, it's probably because they're registering for something or doing something similar to that, whatever it happens to be. All right? But you want to make it harder for them to screw up, because if they enter in a bunch of information and then they're told you did it wrong, and especially if your form is set up very poorly where you ask them to re-enter it again, they might just say the heck with it. This isn't worth even doing. All right, so you want to catch and make sure that the users from the get-go don't enter erroneous information. All right. Notice they're removing default values from select lists. Well, one thing about that is if I set up a list of states, all right, and I've got it in there as a drop-down select list, a lot of times what you see when a person does that is they put on there, for the first entry, it'll say, please select a state. Because if you don't do something like that, then instead of having please select a state, the first or default entry will end up then being Alabama. So if somebody doesn't remember to fill in a state and you've got it set to please enter a state, that's much easier to check. But if you don't put that in and they used Alabama, all right, you won't know one way or the other. Did they mean Alabama or did they just forget to put in a state? All right. JavaScript can also set a selected index property to -1. See, again, remember how programmers count. If you set the selected index to 0, that means it's the first element. If you set it to -1, that means that nothing has been chosen. Some of the other things that you can put in here, and this is the chart that's on the top of page 372. The first is length. All right, and that returns the number of option elements nested within the select element. Multiple, which is a Boolean that says can you choose multiple things or only choose one thing. Options, which returns a collection of the elements nested within the select element. Selected index, which is basically the index of the value you selected. Size, which returns the number of options to be displayed at one time. And type, which returns the type of the selector list, whether it's select one or select multiple. And again, there are examples after examples in the book here. I'm just going over the material that's presented here in the PowerPoint presentations. Dynamically updating selection list values. Well, as you'll see probably on the next slide, you can use, and what we looked at before, you can use different properties and combinations with methods that we talked about back in Chapter 5, where we can, again, create and attach nodes in the node tree. So you can add and remove options. So what if, for example, you had a drop-down, and that drop-down had country in it. You had a site that allowed you to choose different countries. And this just came to mind. I don't know how or why, but let's say that you've got a website that's literally being looked at internationally, and you've got a list of countries that people can use to choose what country they come from. Now you've got somebody, let's say that they come from North Vietnam, and they go to your website, and you notice on the list of countries, North Vietnam isn't in there. So you can set it up so they can add a country. All right, if you want to do that. That'd just be an example. Maybe not a great one, but just so you can see what's happening. So these different properties of the option elements are shown in Table 6.9 on your screen here and on page 375 in your book. They include default selected, which returns a Boolean value that determines whether the option element, the currently selected one, all right, includes the selected attribute. Index, which returns a number representing the element number from within the collection, again starting with 0. So the first element is element 0, and if nothing is selected, it's set to -1. Label, which sets or returns or gets alternate text to be displayed for the option. Selected, which sets or again gets a Boolean that determines whether an option is selected. Text, which sets or again gets the text displayed for an option in the selector list. And value, which sets or again gets the text that's assigned to the option element's value attribute. Now, this is a little hard to probably understand, but the figure that you see here is used both diagrammatically and kind of programmatically in the example that's for a floral shop that's used in this particular chapter. All right. And one of the things that they're checking is the month that's being used, so you can see that they're determining the number of days, and if it's February, whether or not it's a leap year. Again, this is a very extensive example that goes over several pages, around 375 to about 385 or so. Or even longer than that. All right. Placeholder text. The placeholder attribute, as it says, is supported by modern browsers, but you can recreate using placeholder text for older browsers. But you have to do it programmatically. Again, the idea is within years, but no one knows how many years that is, everyone will be using a new enough browser that this isn't going to be an issue. But again, the problem is exactly when does that happen? All right, when is the magical date that everyone is using a browser that's going to support this stuff? And that's the problem, is literally no one knows. Automatically updating an associated field based on a user entry. Now, what I'm about to tell you, you could do, but this would take a lot of work on your part. And what I'm saying is the following. Okay, as an example, I remember years ago, not that many years ago, but years ago, getting calls on the telephone from telemarketers, and they would ask me, if I was going to talk to them that long, what's your zip code? And I tell them my zip code of where I was living at the time, and they said, oh, you're in this city, which is in this state. So they could tell based on my on my zip code, what my city and state was. Well, that's automatically updating associated fields depending on a user entry. I know that about a week ago, I got a pizza from Pizza Hut. And afterwards, the next day, I ordered it online, and they asked me to fill out a survey. And everything was fine, except I noticed that the parking lot was a little bit dirty. So when I filled out all the information, and they asked me to rank this and rank that, the people there were very nice. The food was ready on time. It was that price, etc. They were very pleasant. So I gave them all 5 out of 5s. Okay, but then when I did the location itself, I gave it a 4. Well, what happened immediately, as soon as I gave it that 4, is it did a drill down. So in other words, it brought up another form that said, well, we noticed you only gave this a 4. What was the problem? All right. So as it says, if I'd have given it all 5s, I would not have gotten that form up. So again, that's something that was done programmatically. All right. You probably have seen things like this before, where somebody asks you information regarding, where to ship something, and you fill in all the information, and then next to it they have all the same values, maybe right to the right of it, but there's a box up above that says same as the one on the left is for the shipping address, and the one on the right is for billing address, for example. And then on the top of the right, they have a checkbox that says same as shipping address, because if it's the same address for both and you check the box, you don't have to enter the information in again. You wouldn't want to do that. That's a hardship on the user. The user could make a mistake or could forget to put something out there too. You don't want to do that. It just is a silly thing to do. So you'd fill this in, and then that's for the billing, and for the delivery you'd click here, and that would automatically fill all these fields in based on what's right there. Okay. All right. We've already mentioned that modern browsers can do as much HTML5 validation as you put in. All right. It's known as browser-based validation, native validation, or HTML5 validation. And if we look here at table 612, which is in your book up on page 394, we see some of the things that are in there. See, these are some of the things that can be set. All right. And we've got form no validate. All right. Toggles off validation of the form when added to an input tag for a submit button. Max, which specifies the max number of characters you can put in for a field. Min, which is the minimum number. So for instance, I might have a field, zip, that I might set the max to 5. I'm sorry, I might set the minimum to 5, the min to 5, and I might set the max to 10, which would be 5 digits, a dash, and 4 digits. There are patterns that you can put in, and these have to do with regular expressions, which we'll talk about at some other point in the book. All right, required, that we've already mentioned, that makes a field required. And step, which is a numerical value. So for instance, if I was going to ask you for a salary, and the salary, let's say, had to be between $10,000 and, I don't know, let's say $20,000 as an example. All right, then I could set a step so that rather than going from 10,000 to 10,001 to 10,002, I could make a jump by 1,000. So it could go from 10,000 to 11,000 to 12,000, etc., all the way until I reached 20,000. All right. When we get to chapter, I think it's chapter 8. Yeah, in chapter 8, we are going to talk about these regular expressions in more depth and breadth of coverage, so don't worry about them until that time. Table 613, which you see here and is also on page 395 on the top of the page in the book, shows some values for type attributes that trigger browser-based validation. So if you put a color in there, you have to put it in the correct format. And if you have relevant time components and date components, they must be put in the correct format. An email address must be formatted correctly, and a number must actually be a numerical value. Modern browsers, as it says, display feedback in similar ways. So after you click submit, you might get pushed to another page if everything worked okay, and you might put on there, you might let the user know that, yeah, everything was okay, or that the user made a mistake. All right, and you might take all the fields that had a problem and put messages to the right of them in red and bold or something so that it stands out. They talk here about the validity object, and we're going to see this in just a minute, so let's move ahead here. So the validity properties themselves are shown in table 614 that's on the bottom of page 398. All right, so when you're checking things for validity, these are different kinds of checks that you'd be able to make. So you can check validity and you can set custom validity patterns. Now, again, this whole thing, just so you know, it's, for lack of better words, it's kind of like a puzzle or kind of like a game, in that you are responsible for figuring out what you should do using HTML, what you should do using CSS, and what you should do using JavaScript. There will probably be some overlap because it's better to be a little bit too cautious than it is to not be cautious enough. So notice they're using the set custom validity in here. There they're doing it using JavaScript. There they're doing it, all right, using CSS. So this is the kind of thing that you're going to want. You can get a message that says, please fill out this field like that, but you can do that by just setting up basically your HTML5 constraints. But you might want to do something with color, because with most people, they equate red or some derivation of red, even something like pink, as being something that's problematic. So what you could do is not only have the message come out that says fill out this field, but you could change the color, and you could make sure the focus is set there also. All right, this is what they're talking about here. So how much of this do you want to do? You know, you want to do as much as you deem necessary to do. All right, some common validation functions. Make sure that a field that's required actually has an entry in it. All right, checking for appropriate content type. I mentioned that before, that if I have a field like that says something along the lines of salary, that I'm using numbers. All right, so how about you put all your stuff in, or you think you put everything in. So now you click a button, and that button that you've clicked is at least supposed to be submitting the data. All right, so as said, the submit method, or the submit event, is going to fire when the form has been submitted. That's when you click the submit button, typically. Data is usually validated when the submit button fires, not until then. You have no guarantee that if the user has inputs to fill out, let's see, we have an example here, no. But if the user is filling out something, and there's 10 fields, we have no guarantee that they're going to fill it out field 1, then field 2, then field 3. They may skip around, or they may accidentally not fill out a certain field and then come back to it later. So you don't want to validate until the user presses the submit button, because that's their notification to you that they think that the form is ready to be submitted. If you use the prevent default method, which again we'll talk about in here and we'll talk about more in later chapters, you can disable the default behavior when an event fires. So if you want to force the user to stay on the page they're on, even if they click the submit button, you can use prevent default. All right, notice that that's not supported in the older IE8 version. So, retrieving values of required fields, then checking to see whether or not they're empty. Again, there are many, 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 many different ways that you can come in and try to check to see whether or not some field that you're supposed to be validating is indeed valid. All right, I want to just show you a couple of these. Hopefully I'm not going to rue the time that I'm doing here, but I think this will be okay. JavaScript form validation. All right, and I'm going to go first to W3 schools here. Okay, and you'll notice they have some examples here. I'm not saying these are great examples or not great examples, but here it says, please input a number between 1 and 10. Well, notice it's not valid because I didn't put anything in. If I put in something that's greater than 10, again, not valid. If I put in something that's less than 1, not valid. If I put in something that's within the range, input OK. So they show you the code for how you can do that. All right, some of it's done with just with just HTML, and some of it's done with JavaScript. There should be another one that's in here. If I might have to look for it, but there we go. Tyzag.com, which I've used before. And this is quite an extensive example, and it may not look like it, but let's go down to the bottom here. Validating a form all at once. So here's your form. There's a first name, an address, a zip code, a state, a username, and an email, it looks like. And then there's a check form. So notice all that they have in here. So this is all being done, and it's all being done utilizing JavaScript. So you have so many options out there for you to look at. And the reason I mention these is quite often if you go to a couple different sites for something like JavaScript form validation, you'll see different styles that different programmers will use. And it's kind of neat to look at other people's styles so you can see what you think does or does not work. Or a style that you think is a good style or maybe not a good style. All right, we're close to the end here. Try catch would be another way to do it. Okay, so there's so many different ways that you can do this. You can write your own functions. You can write one big function that does everything. You can write like a generic function that'll handle all sorts of different things for you. You can write customized functions. The thing I would tell you is when you're doing this kind of stuff, all right, when you're doing all of this kind of stuff, don't try to put everything into one function. In other words, if you've got a very complex form, don't put in all sorts of different stuff into the same function. Remember, a function is supposed to be a logical unit that by default should be doing one and just one thing. All right, and they're showing some different checks and stuff that you can make here. But again, much of this stuff that you do is going to be dependent upon your own personal style. And you say, well, geez, I'm just starting this. I don't have any style. Yeah, but it's all stuff that you learn over time. That's what the whole thing is about. Remember, if we're checking for numeric, that we now know how to do that in JavaScript using the isNaN or is not a number function. When we get to Chapter 8, as I mentioned, we'll talk in depth and breadth of coverage about regular expressions. All right. So this chapter talked about validation. And validation means making sure that you're conforming to some rules. And in particular, we talked about validating forms. One of the things that was mentioned in here is we wanted to use what are referred to as assistive functions. You want to make it virtually impossible for the person who's trying to validate or the person using your form to screw up. Browser-based validation is built into modern browsers. We've talked about, again, it's about some of the HTML5 stuff you can use. All right. We mentioned the prevent default on here to block what's normally associated with an event. We talked about validation and requiring things, writing functions, using built-in functions, using built-in methods, using built-in properties. Remember, -1 typically means nothing has been selected. All right. And again, just some more examples. But form validation, in my opinion, in very many ways, it's an art more than it is a science, because there are so many different ways of doing it. There's so many different ways of interpreting what it is that you're trying to do. That's pretty much it for this chapter. So when I come back, we will go into Chapter 7, which is going to really pretty much totally change gears, and we're going to talk about using object-oriented JavaScript. Chapter 7 starts on page 452. And again, it's using object-oriented JavaScript. So I'll be back with that lecture shortly.